Inside a museum in Cairo lies the only royal mummy from ancient Egypt that no one has ever dared to open. Every other pharaoh found in the last 2 centuries was unwrapped, cut into, studied, and put on display. Tutankhamun, Ramses the Great, Seti the First. All of them opened. All of them except one. For 140 years, this single mummy stayed sealed inside its bandages, exactly as ancient hands left it 3,000 years ago. And when scientists finally found a way to look inside without touching a single strand of linen, the machine showed them something no one expected. A body covered in gold. A skull separated from its spine. A chest hiding an amulet placed directly over the heart. And injuries that told a story of grave robbers, secret midnight burials, and priests who risked everything to protect a dead king. But the strangest discovery wasn't the gold, it wasn't the injuries, it was something the embalmers left inside his head. Something that breaks the most basic rule of Egyptian mummification. Something that, according to everything we know about how pharaohs were preserved, should not be there. That discovery is coming. But first, you need to understand why this mummy was never opened in the first place. Because that decision, made by one man standing in a museum basement over a century ago, is the only reason this story exists at all. Most people walk right past it. In the halls of the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo, surrounded by 21 other royal mummies, this one doesn't look like much from the outside. A wrapped figure, a painted face mask, some dried flowers. But those dried flowers are over 3,000 years old. Garlands of red, yellow, and blue blossoms, delphinium and acacia and safflower laid across the body by human hands 1,000 years before Rome was founded. And that painted mask, made of linen and plaster with inlaid stone eyes, is so delicate that removing it would destroy it forever. That's the reason no one ever opened this mummy. It was too beautiful to ruin. Which means that everything underneath the bandages, every secret, every injury, every piece of gold, stayed hidden in total darkness while every other king of Egypt was stripped bare under museum lights. Here's what makes this different from every other mummy story you've heard. This isn't about a curse. This isn't about speculation. This is about a real scientific investigation, published in a peer-reviewed medical journal, that digitally peeled back layer after layer of a sealed royal burial and found evidence of a crime, a cover-up, and a rescue operation carried out in the dead of night 3,000 years ago. The scans exposed all of it. And by the end of this, you'll understand why the people who wrapped this body for the last time weren't just embalmers. They were witnesses. They saw something in the burial grounds of Egypt that forced them to act. And what they did with this king's body is the only surviving record of it. The story starts in 1881, in the cliffs above Deir el-Bahari, on the west bank of the Nile near Luxor. For years, artifacts had been appearing on the antiquities market that should not have existed. Funeral papyri belonging to kings whose tombs had never been found. Jewelry inscribed with royal names. Objects that could only have come from one place, an undiscovered royal burial. The authorities traced the leaks to a local family who had been quietly selling pieces from a tomb they'd found in the cliffs. And when investigators finally climbed down into that hidden shaft, they found something no archaeologist had ever seen before or since. Not one royal burial, dozens. Coffin after coffin after coffin, stacked in the darkness of a single secret chamber. Kings and queens of Egypt's greatest dynasties gathered together in one hidden tomb. History calls it the Royal Cache, Tomb TT 320. For roughly a decade before its official discovery, the family who found it had been climbing down that shaft with ropes and candles, moving among the coffins of god kings, taking small pieces to sell. When the authorities finally emptied the chamber in the summer of 1881, it took hundreds of workers just days to haul everything up the cliff. And eyewitnesses describe villagers lining the banks of the Nile as the boat carrying the dead pharaohs sailed north to Cairo, women wailing, and men firing rifles into the air, mourning kings who had died 3,000 years earlier as if the funerals were happening that day. Inside that chamber were some of the most famous rulers who ever lived: Ramses II, Seti I, Tutmosis III, and among them, one coffin holding a mummy so perfectly wrapped, so carefully adorned with flowers, and a painted mask that it stood apart from all the others. The name on the coffin was Amenhotep the First, second pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, ruler of Egypt around 1525 to 1504 BC, at the very dawn of the empire that would produce Tutankhamun and Ramses the Great. A king so revered that after his death, the Egyptians did something they almost never did. They turned him into a god. For centuries after he died, workers in the royal necropolis worshipped him as their patron deity. Statues of him were carried through villages. Oracles spoke in his name. He wasn't just remembered, he was prayed to. And here's the first strange detail. Every royal mummy pulled from that cache was eventually unwrapped. It was the standard practice of the era. Gaston Maspero, the head of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, personally unwrapped pharaoh after pharaoh in front of audiences. Ramses II was unwrapped in 1886 in a session that took less than 15 minutes. But when Maspero came to Amenhotep the First, he stopped. The wrapping was too perfect, the mask too fragile. The flower garlands still held their color after 3 millennia. Maspero looked at this mummy and made a decision that no one ever reversed. Leave it sealed. And for the next 140 years, through 2 world wars, through revolutions, through the entire history of modern Egyptology, that decision held. Every technology that came along was tried on other mummies first. X-rays in the 1930s gave blurry glimpses, but no one cut the linen. No one lifted the mask. The last human beings to see this king's face lived 3,000 years ago. Think about how rare that is. Unwrapping was the culture of the age. Victorian Europe held mummy unwrapping parties as entertainment. Tickets sold, champagne served, bandages cut in front of applauding crowds. Countless mummies were destroyed that way, ground into medicine, burned, discarded. Against that backdrop, one man's hesitation in a Cairo museum preserved the only sealed royal time capsule Egypt has left. Every secret you're about to hear exists because of that single moment of restraint. Until May 4th, 2019. On that day, in the garden of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, a truck was parked among the palm trees. Inside the truck was a multi-detector CT scanner, the same machine hospitals use to look inside living patients. And carried out to that truck, with the care you'd give a newborn, was the sealed mummy of Amenhotep the First. The plan was simple and radical at the same time. Don't unwrap him with hands. Unwrap him with radiation. Take thousands of cross-sectional images, millimeter by millimeter, and let software rebuild everything inside in 3 dimensions. The mask, the bandages, the body, the bones. Digital unwrapping. No damage, no destruction. Just light passing through 3,000 years of secrets. The software could isolate each layer independently. Strip away the mask and see the bandages beneath it. Strip away the bandages and see the skin. Strip away the skin and see the skeleton, the amulets, the resin, everything in any order from any angle, and then put it all back with a keystroke. The mummy would go back to its display case exactly as it left. But the researchers would walk away, carrying everything it had been hiding since the Bronze Age. The team was led by Dr. Sahar Salim, a radiologist at Cairo University, working alongside the famous Egyptologist Dr. Zahi Hawass. They had already scanned dozens of royal mummies as part of the Egyptian Mummy Project. But this one was different. Every other mummy they'd scanned had been opened before, disturbed, handled, rearranged. This one was a time capsule. Whatever the scanner found inside would be exactly what ancient hands had left there. Untouched, unedited, a sealed message from the ancient world. The first images came back, and the face of a king who had been hidden for 3 millennia appeared on a computer screen. Amenhotep the First was about 35 years old when he died. He stood roughly 169 centimeters tall, about 5'6". He had an oval face, a narrow chin, a small narrow nose, curly hair, and slightly protruding upper front teeth. His teeth were in remarkable condition, barely worn, which for the ancient world was almost unheard of. His left earlobe was pierced, and researchers noted something almost eerie. He looked like his father. The scans of Amenhotep the First, the founder of the dynasty, showed the same narrow chin, the same nose, the same family face passed from father to son 3,500 years ago, and now reconstructed pixel by pixel. Then they went deeper, below the face, below the bandages, and the discoveries started coming fast. Scattered through the wrappings and resting against the body were amulets and pieces of jewelry. Not one or two, 30. 30 individual objects hidden inside the linen. Rings, beads, protective charms in the shapes the Egyptians believed would shield the dead in the afterlife. And around his waist, the scans revealed something extraordinary. A girdle of 34 beads, dense metallic beads, that the imaging strongly suggests are solid gold, still encircling the body of the king. A belt of gold, sealed inside the wrappings that no living person had ever seen. Similar girdles had been found on royal women of this exact dynasty, and they carried meaning beyond wealth. They were protective, ceremonial, tied to rebirth. Whoever placed this one on the king intended it to travel with him into eternity, and against every odd it did. Stop and think about what that means. This mummy passed through the hands of ancient priests through the discovery of 1881 through 140 years in museums, and the gold was there the entire time. Nobody knew. If Maspero had unwrapped him in the 1880s like all the others, that girdle would have been removed, cataloged, maybe lost, maybe stolen. Instead, it stayed exactly where ancient hands placed it. The decision not to open the mummy accidentally preserved the only untouched royal jewelry assemblage of its kind. If you're finding this as fascinating as I did, hit subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of buried history we investigate every single week. And the next discovery in this scan is the one that changes the whole story. Because when the researchers examined the skull, they found something that made no sense. The brain was still inside. You need to understand why that's shocking. Egyptian royal mummification followed a strict procedure, and step one was always the same: remove the brain. The embalmers inserted a hooked instrument through the nose, broke through the thin bone called the cribriform plate, and extracted the brain, because they believed it was useless tissue that would rot the body from within. Tutankhamun's brain was removed. Ramses II's brain was removed. Virtually every royal mummy of the New Kingdom had an empty skull. But the scans of Amenhotep the First showed an intact cribriform plate. No hole, no entry point. And resting at the back of his skull, shrunken and dried but unmistakably present, his actual brain. The brain of a pharaoh, still inside his head, after 3,500 years. For decades, scholars assumed all royal mummies of this era were processed the same way. The scans proved that assumption wrong. Either the mummification traditions were still evolving in the early 18th dynasty, or the embalmers made a deliberate choice we don't understand. His heart, the organ the Egyptians considered the seat of the soul, was left in his chest as tradition demanded. But it wasn't just left there. The scans show an amulet placed directly on top of it, sitting inside the body cavity. A charm laid over the heart of a king, meant to protect him in the judgment of the afterlife, sealed in flesh and linen, and never meant to be seen by human eyes again. The embalmers eviscerated the body through a vertical cut on his left flank, preserved the organs, packed the cavity, and closed him up with his heart guarded by gold. So far, the scans had revealed a beautiful, careful, reverent burial. But then the images moved to the neck, and the story turned dark. because Amenhotep the First's head is not attached to his body. The scans show a clean separation. His neck was broken, his head detached completely. And it doesn't stop there. His right hand is dislocated at the wrist and displaced, sitting in front of his forearm rather than in line with it. His left arm is detached. Part of his abdominal wall is damaged, with a hole in the front of the body. These aren't the marks of disease. They aren't battle wounds. Every one of these injuries happened after death, long after death. Here's where it gets strange. If the embalmers who originally wrapped this king treated him with such care, placing gold on his heart and garlands on his coffin, who tore his head off? The answer is written in ancient records, and it's uglier than you'd think. Centuries after Amenhotep the First died, Egypt fell into chaos. The new kingdom collapsed. Central authority crumbled. And the Valley of the Kings, the most sacred burial ground on earth, became a hunting ground. Tomb robbers moved through the necropolis systematically, and they weren't gentle. They knew that royal mummies were wrapped with jewelry and amulets threaded through the bandages. So they didn't unwrap mummies carefully. They ripped them apart. They tore off limbs to strip bracelets. They broke necks, pulling off collars and necklaces. Ancient court documents from this exact period record the trials of tomb robbers, complete with confessions describing how they burned coffins and ripped royal bodies apart for gold. The damage on Amenhotep the First matches that pattern precisely. His head was torn off by human hands searching for treasure around his neck. His hand was wrenched loose by someone stripping ornaments from his wrist. Roughly 400 years after he was laid to rest as a god, thieves desecrated his body in the dark. And remember, this wasn't just any king to the people of that region. This was the god of the necropolis workers, the patron deity of the very community that lived beside those tombs. Which raises a disturbing possibility that the ancient trial records support. The robbers weren't outsiders. In many documented cases, they were the workers themselves, the guards, the officials, the people whose ancestors had prayed to this exact king. When a civilization starts eating its own gods for gold, you know the collapse is total. And this is where the real story begins. Because someone found him like that. Around the 11th century BC, during the 21st dynasty, the high priests of Amun in Thebes discovered what was happening to the royal tombs. The kings of Egypt's golden age, the god rulers their entire civilization was built around, were being mutilated for scrap gold. And the priests launched what can only be described as a rescue operation. Under conditions of extreme secrecy, they entered the violated tombs, gathered the broken royal mummies, restored them, rewrapped them, and moved them. Not once, multiple times. Inscriptions written in ink on the coffins and dockets record the movements, the dates, the priests responsible. These weren't legends written centuries later. They were labels, written by the men doing the work, in the moment, like evidence tags on a crime scene. Year this, month that. On this day, the king was carried, restored, made whole. We can literally read the paper trail of a covert operation conducted 3,000 years ago. Amenhotep the First himself was restored and rewrapped at least twice by these priests. And their final solution was the hidden cliff shaft at Deir el-Bahari, one secret chamber, unmarked, unfindable, where they gathered dozens of kings and queens and sealed them away from the world. That's the royal cache. That's why all those pharaohs were found stacked together in 1881. The cache wasn't a tomb, it was a safe house. But for over a century, historians have accused those priests of something darker. The mainstream theory said the rescue operation was a cover story, that the priests themselves were the real robbers, systematically stripping the royal mummies of their gold under official protection and reusing the treasures for their own dynasty's burials. And there's evidence for it. Coffins made for earlier kings were found reused by later ones. Royal burial equipment turned up repurposed. The theory painted the 21st dynasty priests as state-sanctioned looters who unwrapped the kings, took everything of value, and rewrapped the bodies in cheap linen to hide the theft. But that explanation has a problem. And the problem is this exact scan. Because Amenhotep the First is the control experiment history accidentally left us. His rewrapping by those priests was never opened, never touched. If the priests were thieves, his wrappings should be empty. Every amulet gone, every bead stripped. What did the scanner actually find? 30 amulets, a golden girdle around his waist, jewelry left in place deliberately by the very priests accused of stealing it. The scans show they didn't just leave his treasures. They repaired him. The detached head was carefully realigned with the body. The damaged abdominal wall was covered with a band of resin-treated linen. The detached left arm and dislocated hand were wrapped back into position against the body. Broken pieces were held together with bandages placed like splints. This wasn't looting. This was restoration. Someone knelt over the mutilated body of a 400-year dead king and put him back together, piece by piece, then sealed gold inside the wrappings where no living person would ever benefit from it. You don't do that for profit. You do that for belief. The priests weren't robbing Amenhotep the First. They were healing him. And this scan of the one royal mummy their work survived on untouched is the strongest evidence ever found in their defense. A 3,000-year-old accusation answered by a hospital scanner in a museum garden. That's the second revelation. The third is the one nobody can close, because there's a question the scans raised that they could not answer. How did Amenhotep the First die? He was around 35, young for a king whose dynasty was famous for long reigns. The scans searched his entire body for the things that kill people: wounds, fractures that happen during life, signs of disease, arthritis, dental infection, tumors. They found nothing. His teeth were excellent. His bones were healthy. There is no visible cause of death anywhere in his body. A healthy man in his mid-30s, ruler of the most powerful nation on earth, simply died. And the records of his reign go silent on how. 21 years on the throne, military campaigns, massive building projects, and then nothing. Whatever ended his life left no mark the scanner could see. Poison wouldn't show. Infection in soft tissue wouldn't survive. A drowning, a fever, a sudden collapse. None of it leaves a trace after 3 millennia. The one question everyone wanted answered is the one question the mummy refuses to give up. And history makes the silence louder. He died without a surviving son. The throne passed sideways to a military man named Tutmosa, who wasn't his child. A healthy young king with no heir dies of nothing visible, and his dynasty quietly changes bloodlines. Egyptologists don't call it suspicious, because there's no evidence to call it anything. But 3,500 years later, the file is still open. And there's a bigger mystery wrapped around this king, one that extends beyond his body entirely. Amenhotep the First is one of the only major pharaohs of the New Kingdom whose original tomb has never been positively identified. We have his body, we have his coffin, we have records of ancient inspectors checking his tomb and reporting it intact. We even have an ancient document describing the tomb's location in measurements from known landmarks. And yet, in over a century of searching the Theban hills, no one has ever conclusively found it. Candidate tombs have been proposed, none confirmed. Somewhere in those cliffs is the original burial place of a king who was worshipped as a god, a tomb that ancient records say existed and was inspected, and it is still lost. The body escaped the robbers. The tomb escaped everyone. Now, does any of this prove some extreme hidden conspiracy? No. And it's worth slowing down here, because the grounded version of this story deserves to be told straight. Skeptics will point out, correctly, that nothing about this discovery is supernatural. The brain left in the skull likely reflects early 18th dynasty practice before brain removal became standard. The missing cause of death is normal. Most mummies don't reveal one because most causes of death don't touch bone. The lost tomb is probably an identification problem, not a cover-up. One of the candidate tombs in the cliffs may well be his, stripped so bare by ancient robbers that nothing remains to prove ownership. And the priest's restoration, as moving as it is, was also practical politics. Their dynasty's legitimacy rested on the cult of the old kings. Protecting the royal ancestors protected their own power. All of that is true, but none of it makes this ordinary. Because even the skeptical version of this story is a story about a real crime scene preserved for 3,000 years, a real rescue operation confirmed by forensic evidence, and a real scientific method that let us open a sealed royal burial without breaking a single thread. The mundane explanation is still a miracle of preservation. The one royal mummy nobody opened became the only one that could still testify. And that's what the scans really exposed. Not just a body, a chain of human hands across 30 centuries. The embalmers who left his brain in place and laid an amulet on his heart. The robbers who tore his head off for a necklace. The priests who gathered his broken pieces at night and made him whole again, then hid him so well that history itself lost track. The family who found the cash and kept it secret for a decade. The archaeologist who looked at the flowers and the painted mask and couldn't bring himself to cut. And the radiologist, 140 years later, who finally saw the king's face on a screen and realized he looked like his father. Every link in that chain made a choice. And because of those choices, Amenhotep the First is now the best preserved message the ancient world ever sent us. In April 2021, he was carried through the streets of Cairo in the Royal Golden Parade. 22 kings and queens moved to their new home in a procession watched by millions, treated once again like the god his people believed he was. 3,000 years after priests carried his body through the darkness to save it, he was carried through the light. But think about what remains unanswered. Somewhere in the cliffs above Luxor, his original tomb is still hiding, its entrance sealed by rubble or sand, or simple anonymity, possibly walked past by tourists and archaeologists every single year. Whatever killed a healthy 35-year-old god king remains invisible, locked in tissue no scanner can read. And the mummy itself, the only sealed royal burial left on Earth, still lies behind glass in Cairo, with its mask in place and its flowers intact, its golden girdle exactly where ancient fingers fastened it, holding secrets that even the machine could not fully reach. It was robbed, it was rescued, it was hidden, and it has still never been opened. Maybe it never will be. If this is your kind of history, the next investigation is already on your screen. Click it now.